When they pulled John Jacob Astor IV from the North Atlantic, he had been in the water for a week. His body was identified by the initials stitched inside his jacket. In his pocket was a gold watch. That watch was given to his son. Vincent Astor was 20 years old, a sophomore at Harvard who had never managed anything more complex than his own class schedule. And now, because an ocean liner hit an iceberg on a Sunday night in April of 1912, he owned more of Manhattan than most people could walk across in a day. The St. Regis Hotel, entire blocks of the West Side, slum housing in the Lower East Side that had been collecting rent for the Astor family since before the Civil War. The newspapers called him the richest boy in the world. I keep coming back to that word, boy, because everything that happened to Vincent Astor over the next 47 years was shaped by the fact that he received all of this too soon, from a father who died too suddenly, in a family that had never once taught anyone how to be a decent human being. He tried, though. That is the part of this story most people miss. Vincent Astor sold the slum housing, built playgrounds in Harlem, converted run-down brownstones into apartments for working families. He ran a secret intelligence operation for Franklin Roosevelt out of his office building on Madison Avenue. He let the FBI use rooms in his own skyscraper to spy on Nazi agents 2 floors below. He sailed the Pacific on a private espionage mission, mapping Japanese military positions in the Marshall Islands 3 years before Pearl Harbor. And none of it was enough. Not for the public, who never saw past the Astor name. Not for the women he married, who found him impossible to live with. Not for himself. He carried that gold watch every single day of his life. I think about what that means. Every morning, reaching into a drawer and putting your dead father's timepiece into your pocket. A clock that stopped keeping accurate time somewhere in the North Atlantic. A reminder of the moment everything landed on you, whether you were ready or not. Vincent Astor died on February 3rd, 1959. He was 67. No children, no heirs, 3 marriages, all failures. A fortune of over $100 million left almost entirely to a charitable foundation. His half-brother, a man he had hated since birth, got nothing. His third wife, Brooke, took what Vincent had started and turned it into something the city actually loved. She gave away more than $200 million. Then she turned 105, developed Alzheimer's, and her own son robbed her. The Astor fortune, which began with a German immigrant selling beaver pelts on the streets of Lower Manhattan, ended in a courtroom. But that is the epilogue. The story is the man with the watch. The first, John Jacob Astor, arrived in America from the German village of Waldorf in 1784. He sold flutes, then fur. Then he figured out that the real money in New York was not in what you sold, but in what you stood on. He bought land, block after block, lot after lot, acre after acre. He bought farms north of the city line and waited for Manhattan to grow into them. It always did. When he died in 1848, he was the richest man in America. His strategy was simple enough that his descendants followed it for 4 generations without needing to add a single new idea. Buy Manhattan. Hold it. Collect rent. By the time Vincent's father inherited the family operation, the Astor real estate portfolio covered enormous swaths of the city. Tenements on the Lower East Side, hotels in Midtown, empty lots in what would become the Upper West Side. The family had owned so much of New York for so long that people called them the landlords of Manhattan, and they had earned that title in the least flattering way possible. The Astors were known, correctly, as slum landlords. Their tenement buildings were overcrowded, poorly maintained, and wildly profitable. This is what Vincent inherited at 20. Not just the money, the reputation, the slum buildings, the political enemies, the expectations, an entire apparatus of wealth that had been running on autopilot since before the Civil War, and a public that had already made up its mind about what the Astor name meant. His father had been a strange man, tall, awkward, with an inventor's obsession for mechanical projects and a socialite's need to be seen at the right events. John Jacob Astor IV built the St. Regis Hotel on Fifth Avenue, patented a bicycle brake, designed a pneumatic road improver that nobody wanted, and wrote a science fiction novel about life on other planets. He divorced Vincent's mother in 1909 after a marriage that New York society privately called Beauty and the Beast. Then, at 47, he married an 18-year-old named Madeline Force. She was a year younger than his own son. Vincent served as best man at his father's second wedding. I want to sit with that detail for a moment. He was 19. He loathed Madeline, and he stood next to his father and watched him marry a girl who had been in high school when Vincent was already at boarding school. The couple went to Europe and Egypt to wait out the gossip. They were coming home when they boarded the Titanic. Vincent was at Harvard when the news broke. His father put Madeline into a lifeboat and stayed behind. The ship went down at 2:20 in the morning on April 15th, 1912. Over 1,500 people died. John Jacob Astor IV was among them. His body was found a week later by a cable ship called the Mackay Bennett. Madeline survived. She was pregnant with Vincent's half-brother, a boy who would be born 4 months later and named John Jacob Astor VI. Vincent would hate that child for the rest of his life, but that comes later. The will was clear. Vincent received roughly $69 million. In today's money, somewhere near $2 billion. The St. Regis Hotel. Ferncliff, the family's 2,800-acre estate in Rhinebeck, New York, with a 40,000-square-foot pavilion designed by Stanford White. The yacht, Noma, and the real estate portfolio that had made his family the wealthiest in America for nearly a century. He dropped out of Harvard within weeks. What strikes me about Vincent's first months as head of the Astor fortune is how quickly he moved against the family's own legacy. He did not coast on it. He did not simply collect rent and attend galas. He looked at the buildings his family had been profiting from and decided he did not want to be that kind of Astor. The slum properties had to go, not because it was fashionable and not because anyone pressured him. He sold them because he had seen them and he knew what they were. A family biographer later called him a previously unknown phenomenon in America, an Astor with a social conscience. Whether that conscience was genuine idealism or guilt, or some mixture that even Vincent could not have untangled, is a question this documentary will keep circling back to. Because the same man who quietly dismantled the worst of his family's slum buildings could not keep a single marriage alive. The same man who reinvested millions into housing for working families would later forbid his own wife from seeing her son. Something was broken inside Vincent Astor. The money did not break it. His mother did. And that story begins in a closet on Fifth Avenue. The house on Fifth Avenue had more rooms than anyone could count without getting confused halfway through. Ava Astor used one of them as a private dressing room, a walk-in closet, really, off the main bedroom suite, filled with gowns and furs and enough perfume to announce her arrival 3 rooms away. That is where she put her son when she did not want to deal with him. According to accounts that circulated widely through New York society for decades, Ava locked the young Vincent inside her dressing room closet before going out for the evening. She forgot about him. The house was so large, and the staff so accustomed to staying out of Ava's personal quarters that nobody heard him. He banged on the door. He screamed. Hours passed. It was the butler who finally found him. How old was Vincent when this happened? The sources do not agree. Some say he was very young, 4 or 5. Others place it later. The details shift depending on who is telling the story. What does not shift is the fact that multiple people in Vincent's orbit, across decades, repeated it as something everyone understood to be true. His mother locked him in a closet and forgot he existed. Ava Lowell Willing came from one of Philadelphia's oldest families. She was considered stunning, dark-haired, sharp-featured, a woman who entered rooms the way weather systems enter coastlines. She married John Jacob Astor IV in 1891, and the union was immediately understood by their social circle to be a mismatch. He was tall, gangly, and deeply awkward. Society columnists nicknamed them Beauty and the Beast, and neither partner seemed to find the joke especially funny. Vincent was born that same year, on November 15th, in the Fifth Avenue house where his grandmother Caroline Astor still presided over New York society. The fact that he resembled his father was, for Ava, a personal offense. She had produced a child who looked like the wrong side of the family, tall, big feet. The kind of boy who trips over furniture in drawing rooms designed to make tripping impossible. She let him know, not privately, not gently. Ava would dismiss Vincent from her presence when visitors came, reportedly telling him he was not fit to be seen. She sent him away from social occasions. She showed him, in 100 small ways that accumulate into something enormous, that he was a source of embarrassment to her. His father was not much help, though for different reasons. Jack Astor adored Vincent. They sailed together on the family yacht, the Noma, and those trips seem to have been the only stretches of childhood where Vincent felt wanted. But Jack was also a man whose personal life was chaotic in ways the family worked hard to conceal. He had affairs. Friends described his morals as shockingly loose for a warden of the Episcopal Church. Ava, for her part, was rumored to have a lover of her own, a New York society man. Vincent's younger sister Muriel was widely believed not to be Jack's biological daughter. None of this was ever confirmed. All of it was discussed. The marriage ended when Vincent was 17. After the divorce, his mother moved through a series of European social circles and eventually married an English nobleman, Baron Ribblesdale, in 1919. She did not become warmer with age. Vincent remained deferential to her until she died. People who knew him said it went beyond politeness. He was afraid of her. That dynamic, the inability to stand up to the person who hurt him most, would define his relationships with women for the next 4 decades. 3 marriages, 3 different women, the same pattern every time. Withdrawal, control, isolation. The inability to be present in the room with another person without eventually making the room feel like a locked closet. Vincent Astor came out of that childhood missing something. Not confidence, exactly. Something underneath confidence. The ability to believe that another person might actually want to be in the same room with him. And at 20, standing in a Manhattan lawyer's office with more money than he could comprehend and a gold watch, he did not know any of that yet. He only knew that his father was gone. His mother had never wanted him, and every newspaper in America was printing his name. On April 30th, 1914, Vincent Astor married Helen Dinsmore Huntington at her family's estate. He was 22. She was 21. They had grown up near each other in Rhinebeck, and the match made sense on paper. 2 old families, adjacent properties, a shared understanding of the world they inhabited. Vincent arrived at his own wedding with the mumps. The photographs from that day show a groom who looks like he should be in a hospital bed. Pale, visibly unwell. The New York Times headline the next morning mentioned his illness before it mentioned his bride. He went through with the ceremony anyway, because Astors did not cancel events, and because he probably did not yet understand what the disease was about to take from him. Mumps in an adult male can cause complications that do not appear in children. In Vincent's case, the infection left him sterile. At 22, before his marriage had even properly started, the question of an Astor heir was already answered. There would not be one. The family name, the fortune, the estate in Rhinebeck, all of it would end with him. He may not have known this immediately, but he knew eventually, and he never spoke about it publicly. I have read a lot about Gilded Age marriages that were transactional. This one is hard to categorize. Helen Huntington was intelligent, well-connected, and comfortable in the kind of social world Vincent found exhausting. A novelist named Glenway Westcott, who knew her well, described her admiringly in his unpublished diaries as a grand, old-fashioned lesbian. Those diaries are now at Yale. Whether Vincent knew this about his wife is unclear. Whether it mattered to him in practical terms is also unclear, given that the physical dimension of their marriage had been foreclosed by a virus on day one. What is clear is that they stayed married for 26 years. They lived mostly at Ferncliff. They entertained rarely. They had no children, obviously, and seemed to have settled into a companionship defined more by habit and social obligation than by anything resembling warmth. When the United States entered the First World War, Vincent donated the Noma to the Navy for patrol duty and volunteered for active service himself. He was commissioned as an ensign in the Naval Reserve and shipped out in June of 1917. Helen followed him to France, where she did charity work with the YMCA at the naval base in Bordeaux. For a few months, they were closer to each other than they had been in years. War does that sometimes. It compresses the distance between people who would otherwise drift. Vincent was assigned to the armed yacht USS Aphrodite, escorting convoys in the Atlantic. On January 10, 1919, the Aphrodite struck an anchored mine. The explosion was severe enough to threaten the ship. For a moment, Vincent Astor was in a position eerily similar to the one that had killed his father 7 years earlier. A vessel taking on damage in cold water. The arithmetic of survival being calculated in real time. He made it. The ship stayed afloat. He came home. But something about the war, or maybe just the accumulation of everything before it, seemed to seal a certain quiet inside him. After 1919, the accounts of Vincent's personality begin to converge on a consistent portrait. A man who preferred his own company, quick to anger but slow to engage, capable of generosity in the abstract but difficult in person. He pulled practical jokes on people, sometimes cruel ones, and then could not understand why they did not find them funny. He oscillated between wanting to be left alone and wanting desperately to be liked, and never quite figured out how to do either one gracefully. Helen, for her part, seems to have managed their social obligations competently while keeping her own life at a careful distance from his. When they finally divorced in 1940, the grounds listed were mental cruelty. The proceedings were handled in Cody, Wyoming, as far from a New York gossip column as you could reasonably file legal papers in the 1940s. Within a year, Helen married Little Hull, a Florida real estate broker, a friend and business associate of Vincent's. 26 years, no children. A wife whose closest friends knew something her husband may or may not have understood. A groom cursed on his own wedding day by a childhood illness that took from him the one thing his fortune could not buy back. And now he was 48, divorced, and about to marry one of the famous Cushing sisters. But before we get to Minnie, there is a version of Vincent Astor that most people have never heard of. the landlord who tore down his own buildings. There was a piece of land in Harlem that the Astor family had been sitting on for decades, vacant, fenced off, generating zero income but also zero problems, which, for the previous generation of Astors, was the ideal state of any property they did not feel like developing. Vincent looked at it and saw a children's playground. He built it himself. Not literally, obviously. But he directed the project, approved the design, and paid for it out of the family's real estate budget rather than setting up some charitable fund with his name on a plaque. When it was finished, he did the same thing with another lot in the Bronx, this time attaching a full housing complex with enough open space for kids to actually run around in. An Astor property where children played for free. His grandfather would have had a stroke. This was the period, roughly 1913 through the mid-1930s, when Vincent Astor seemed to be running two completely separate lives. In public, he was changing what the Astor name meant in New York. On the West Side, he gutted block after block of aging row houses and turned them into modern apartments aimed at young professionals and artists. He built affordable housing for immigrant families on the Lower East Side, in neighborhoods his own family had been exploiting for rent since the 1850s. The buildings were well designed. They had decent plumbing. They were not the bare minimum dressed up as charity. And then he would go home to Ferncliff or to one of his Manhattan residences and be completely insufferable. People who spent time with Vincent in social settings described an experience that was hard to reconcile with the man building playgrounds. He dominated conversations without being interesting. He had a way of making people feel like they were failing a test they had not agreed to take. At dinner parties, he would fixate on a topic nobody else cared about and refuse to let it go. He collected trains, not model trains, actual narrow-gauge locomotives. He built a private railway on his estate in Bermuda, complete with a miniature Union Station. When guests visited, he expected them to be as fascinated by this as he was. They were not. The Noormahal was his real escape. 263 feet long, 11 staterooms, a dining room that seated 18, and a crew of over 40. Vincent financed the construction partly with profits from his investment in the 1926 film version of Ben-Hur, which is the kind of detail that only exists in the biography of someone who has too much money and not enough oversight. The ship was built by the Krupp Iron Works in Kiel, Germany, the same company that would later build submarines for the Nazi Navy. He took the Noormahal everywhere. At least 6 scientific expeditions to the Galapagos Islands, where his crew captured rare tortoises, tropical fish, and penguins for donation to zoos and research institutions. The government of Ecuador gave him an official commendation. American zoological societies treated him as a serious contributor. These were not vanity cruises. The specimens were real. The science was legitimate. Vincent Astor, a man who could barely hold a dinner party together, was quietly funding some of the first comprehensive biological surveys of the Galapagos. Then he would come back to New York and pick a fight with someone at the Knickerbocker Club. In 1937, he took control of Newsweek magazine, becoming its chairman and principal stockholder. The magazine's offices moved into the Knickerbocker building on Broadway, a property his father had built. This gave Vincent something he had never quite managed as a landlord or a socialite: a voice. Newsweek was not the largest news magazine in the country, but it gave him access to the political conversations that interested him far more than opera boxes or debutante balls. It also connected him more directly to Washington, to policy, to the man who was, by then, both his closest friend and the President of the United States. Forbes magazine compiled its first list of the wealthiest Americans during this period. Vincent appeared at number 12. $75 million. But here is what the Forbes list does not capture. Vincent Astor at number 12 was also a man whose wife barely spoke to him at home. A man who had no children and never would. A man whose social circle tolerated him because of his surname, but rarely sought out his company by choice. He built better housing than any Astor before him. He funded science. He owned a major magazine. And at the end of most days, according to a biographer who studied his routine, he went home, ate dinner alone, and sat by the fire until he fell asleep. The loneliest landlord in New York. That contradiction between the public Vincent who gave generously and the private Vincent who drove everyone away is not something this documentary can resolve. He may not have been able to resolve it himself. What matters for this story is that by the late 1930s, Vincent Astor had built something genuinely useful with his inherited fortune. And he had also built a private life so empty that when someone finally offered him a purpose beyond real estate and dinner parties, he grabbed it with both hands. That purpose came from the White House, and it started in a rented apartment on East 62nd Street. Franklin Roosevelt and Vincent Astor first became friends as boys. Their families' estates in Dutchess County were close enough that the two of them grew up in the same orbit. Similar backgrounds, similar educations, similar assumptions about what people like them owed the country. They drifted apart when Vincent went to St. George's School and Roosevelt went to Groton, and they might have stayed apart if the Titanic had not intervened. After Vincent inherited his fortune at 20, Roosevelt was one of the few people in his life who treated him as something other than a bank account with legs. They were distant cousins, which mattered more in that social world than it would today. They fished together. They sailed together on the Noormahal. When Roosevelt was stricken with polio in 1921 and withdrew from public life, Vincent gave him the use of the heated indoor pool at Astor Courts, his Rhinebeck estate, for hydrotherapy. There is also evidence that Eleanor Roosevelt used the estate's private shooting range. The friendship was not sentimental. It was built on a shared obsession. Both men were fascinated by intelligence, by secrets, by the idea that the right people with the right access could see threats that bureaucracies could not. Roosevelt, during his time as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, had dabbled in intelligence work through the Office of Naval Intelligence, placing friends from Harvard and members of New York society into volunteer roles. He loved the atmosphere, the codes, the secrecy. He later told people he wanted to retire and write detective novels. Vincent shared that appetite, and in 1927, he did something about it. He rented a small apartment at 34 East 62nd Street in Manhattan. Nothing fancy. An unlisted telephone, a mail drop, a place where a small group of men could meet without being noticed. The group had no official charter, no government affiliation, no legal authority. They called themselves the Room. Membership was by invitation and limited to men Vincent trusted completely. Kermit Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's son, was a regular, as were the banker Winthrop Aldrich and the publisher Nelson Doubleday. David Bruce, who would later have a distinguished diplomatic career, attended alongside Marshall Field. Even J.P. Morgan showed up periodically. Fewer than a dozen men at any given time, all of them wealthy, all of them well-connected, and all of them convinced that the regular channels of American intelligence were not adequate to the threats they saw gathering overseas. They met monthly. They shared information gathered from business dealings, foreign travel, and social contacts in Europe. A banker who had just returned from Berlin might report on conversations with German industrialists. A publisher who had been in London might relay something picked up at a diplomatic reception. It was informal. It was amateur. It was also in a way that professional intelligence officers would later find both impressive and irritating, surprisingly effective. After Roosevelt won the presidency in 1932, the room gradually stopped being a private hobby. Vincent had direct access to the White House, not through intermediaries, not through official channels. He could pick up the unlisted telephone on 62nd Street or write a letter delivered by personal courier, and it would reach Roosevelt's desk. The intelligence that the room gathered went straight to the president. Some of this intelligence was serious. Vincent, as a director of the Western Union Cable Company, had access to international communications that no private citizen should have been reading. He intercepted telegrams revealing foreign agents operating out of Mexico. He monitored cables between Spanish embassies in the Americas that exposed Spain's growing alignment with Nazi Germany. He discovered that a Brazilian naval mission purchasing arms in the United States was a front for graft. And he uncovered that the Soviet Union's trading corporation in America, Amtorg, was spending over $2 million a week, much of it funding espionage operations on American soil. Reading other people's telegrams was a federal crime. Vincent did it anyway. Roosevelt not only knew about it, but actively encouraged it. In October of 1939, Vincent reported to the president that he had arranged to intercept foreign radio transmissions, writing that he was doing so in accordance with your wishes. I think this is the part of Vincent Astor's life that people would find hardest to believe if they knew about it. A New York landlord with a yacht and a magazine, spending his evenings in a rented apartment reading intercepted cables and passing intelligence to the President of the United States. Not because he was ordered to, because he volunteered. Because finally, after years of civic projects and social obligations that left him cold, someone he respected had told him he was useful. The room would later be renamed The Club, though the original name is the one that stuck in the historical record. Its members moved freely between social gatherings and intelligence briefings, sometimes in the same evening. They used their wealth and their access as tools, exploiting the fact that men of their social standing could go almost anywhere, meet almost anyone, and ask almost anything without raising suspicion. A gentleman's spy is only possible in a world that assumes gentlemen do not spy. By the late 1930s, that world was about to change completely, and Vincent Astor was about to be asked to do considerably more than read telegrams. I should clarify what Area Controller of Intelligence for New York actually meant, because the title sounds more official than it was. The position did not exist before Vincent Astor. Roosevelt created it specifically for him in early 1941. It came with no staff, no office, no budget, and no clear authority beyond what the president chose to give it. What it did come with was trust. Vincent was now coordinating the work of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Army's Military Intelligence Division, and the Office of Naval Intelligence across New York. Roosevelt wanted his person sitting between these agencies. That person was Vincent. But before the title, there was the cruise. In 1938, Roosevelt asked Vincent and Kermit Roosevelt to take the Nourmahal into the Pacific. The cover story was a fishing trip. The actual purpose was to survey Japanese military installations in the Marshall Islands. Japan had held a mandate over the islands since the First World War, and rumors of fortification had been circulating for years. Nobody in Washington had reliable information about what was actually there. So Vincent sailed the Nourmahal into restricted waters, and Kermit brought a camera. What they found went directly to the President and the Office of Naval Intelligence. The report shaped American assumptions about Japanese capabilities in the Pacific. 3 years before Pearl Harbor, a New York socialite on a private yacht had accomplished work that the military's own apparatus had failed to do. When war broke out in Europe, the pace accelerated. A German businessman named Gerhard Alois Westrich approached members of the Room. He was working on behalf of the Nazi government, looking for American business leaders willing to support Germany after a presumed Axis victory. Within days, letters describing Westrich's activities reached Roosevelt's desk. The gentleman of the Room had flagged a Nazi agent operating openly in New York. They had done it faster than the Bureau. Vincent's reach extended further than domestic surveillance. Through the English branch of his family, he had maintained a quiet relationship with Sir James Paget, who ran the British Passport Control Office in New York. That office was a front. Paget oversaw British intelligence operations across the Western Hemisphere. Vincent established a direct channel between Paget's office and the White House. An American citizen coordinating with a foreign intelligence service without authorization. He did it without hesitation. When William Stevenson arrived to head British security coordination, the relationship deepened. Stevenson wired London on February 4, 1941, reporting that the president had appointed Vincent as his personal liaison. Through Vincent, London gained what it had been desperate for: a reliable back-channel to Roosevelt that bypassed every formal protocol. A particularly sensitive operation involved diplomatic pouches intercepted in the Crown colonies of Bermuda and Trinidad. Vincent wrote to the president that he had given his word never to reveal the details to anyone, with Roosevelt as the only exception. The fear was that if the operation became known, foreign agents would route their communications differently. Several historians believe some of this mail opening took place at Ferry Reach, Vincent's own estate in Bermuda. Meanwhile, Vincent's skyscraper at 444 Madison Avenue had taken on a second life. On the 6th floor, the Bureau occupied room 629. Next door, rooms 627 and 628 housed an outfit called the Diesel Research Company. The name on the door was a fiction. The office was a front run by the Abwehr, Nazi Germany's military intelligence service, through a double agent named William Siebold. From room 629, federal agents monitored every conversation, every transmission, every contact that passed through. For a stretch of months, that floor was arguably the most critical counterintelligence operation running anywhere in the city. He knew what was happening there. He had arranged it. On April 3, 1941, Vincent wrote to Roosevelt. The letter survives in the presidential archives. He told the president that from that point forward, it was up to him. That his appreciation for the responsibility could be better demonstrated through results than through letters. And that in the job, he would do his very best. He meant it. He had spent his entire adult life looking for something that matched the scale of what he had inherited. This was the thing that made Vincent Astor feel like he deserved the fortune, the name, and the gold watch in his pocket. What he did not yet understand was that the very qualities that made him useful to Roosevelt also made him expendable. The professionals were coming, and they did not need a gentleman amateur running the show. William Donovan was everything Vincent Astor was not: a Columbia football star, a decorated war hero who had earned the Medal of Honor in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, a Wall Street lawyer with a gift for navigating Washington's bureaucratic knife fights. When people met Wild Bill Donovan, they remembered his handshake for weeks. When people met Vincent Astor, they remembered his enormous feet and his habit of stepping on other people. Roosevelt needed someone to build a centralized American intelligence service. The existing agencies spent more energy competing with each other than watching the enemy. Vincent, who had been operating in the gaps between them since 1941, believed he was the obvious choice. He was wrong. In June of 1942, Roosevelt created the Office of Strategic Services under Donovan's command. Donovan had spent months in war zones, building relationships with British intelligence at the operational level. He produced reports that showed a professional's grasp of what a modern spy agency required. Vincent had connections and enthusiasm. Donovan had a plan. The appointment stung, but what followed was worse. Someone leaked Vincent's role as the president's private intelligence coordinator, with the implication that a wealthy amateur had been playing spy while professionals were sidelined. A confidential report on Vincent, requested by the president, did nothing to help. His access narrowed. The direct line to Roosevelt grew quieter. The Navy gave him responsibility for coordinating civilian boats along the eastern seaboard, fishing trawlers and private yachts patrolling for German submarines. Real work, but a different category entirely. He had been reading intercepted diplomatic pouches in Bermuda. Now he was scheduling fishing boats off Long Island. A joke circulated about Donovan's agency. People said the initials stood for "Oh So Social," because so many officers came from the same world Vincent inhabited. Most members of the room ended up in the office in some capacity. Vincent did not. The organization, built from the same social clay that had produced him, found no room for the man who had started the whole enterprise. There is a letter in the presidential archives where Vincent complains about a spy master whose operations offended him. The man had an unlimited budget and no discretion. But what bothered Vincent most was that the man was, in his words, a social climber. Even in espionage, Vincent Astor cared about breeding. In 1944, he officially resigned. He was 52. No ceremony. Roosevelt died the following April. With him went the last person who had ever made Vincent Astor feel essential. While all of this unfolded, his second marriage was collapsing. He had married Mary Benedict Cushing in 1940, shortly after divorcing Helen. Minnie, as everyone called her, was the eldest of the famous Cushing sisters. Babe married William Paley, the head of the Columbia Broadcasting System. Betsy married James Roosevelt, the president's son, and later John Hay Whitney. The Cushing sisters moved through the highest corridors of American wealth, and Minnie had married into the oldest money of all. It did not help. Vincent withdrew. He controlled. He made the house feel airless. Minnie, who had been social and well-liked in ways her husband could never manage, stopped trying. By the late 1940s, she refused to go out with him. A tea house was built overlooking the Hudson at Ferncliff, reportedly at her insistence. One gets the sense it was designed less as a social space and more as somewhere to sit and not be near Vincent. The man who had coordinated intelligence for a president could not coordinate a marriage. By 1953, Minnie agreed to a divorce, but only on one condition. She would find him a replacement first. Minnie's first suggestion was Janet Newbold, Ryan Stewart Bush, recently divorced from James Smith Bush II. Vincent approached her. He explained that he was not well, that he was in his early 60s, and that he could not be expected to live for very long. After his death, she would inherit his millions. Janet Bush looked at one of the wealthiest men in America and said she did not even like him. Vincent pressed the point about the money and the short timeline. Janet reportedly answered with 4 words that deserved to survive longer than most things said in New York drawing rooms in the 1950s. What if you do live? I have spent a lot of time with Gilded Age families on this channel, and that exchange is among the most revealing moments I have come across. Not because of Janet's honesty, which is refreshing enough, but because of what it tells us about Vincent. He was 61 years old. He had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. And his pitch to a potential wife was essentially a business proposition built around his own death. "Marry me. I will die soon. Then you get paid." That was his understanding of what he had to offer another human being. Minnie's next recommendation came from Mary Cushing, who suggested Roberta Brooke Russell Marshall. Brooke was 51, once divorced and once widowed, and she came from a world that had nothing to do with the Astor fortune. Her father was John Henry Russell Jr., a career Marine who became the 16th Commandant of the Marine Corps. She had spent her childhood in China, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, following her father from posting to posting. She was not New York society. She was a military kid who had learned to adapt to anything. Her first marriage had been a disaster. She married John Dryden Cusa at 20. According to her own accounts and the biography written by Francis Kiernan, Cusa was an alcoholic who beat her. When she was 6 months pregnant, he broke her jaw during a fight. She filed for divorce and raised her son, Anthony Dryden Cusa, largely on her own. Her second marriage to Charles Henry Marshall was stable but brief. He died in 1952. Vincent and Brooke married on October 8, 1953, several weeks after his divorce from Minnie was finalized. Brooke later said that she called him Pookie. He called her Pookie in return. By every external measure, the match was warmer than either of his previous marriages. They established the Vincent Astor Foundation together. They talked about giving back to New York in ways that went beyond playgrounds and housing projects. But behind closed doors, the old patterns held. Vincent drank heavily. He smoked constantly. His health, fragile since childhood, was deteriorating in ways that no amount of money could reverse. He had suffered at least one heart attack before Brooke married him. Doctors came and went from whatever residence the couple occupied at any given time. They moved between 4 homes, but rarely had visitors. Vincent forbade Brooke from maintaining a relationship with her son Anthony from her first marriage. The woman who had survived a violent husband and raised a child alone was now married to a man who wanted to control whom she was allowed to love. Brooke later claimed that in 6 years of marriage, they went out together only a handful of times. 6 years. A man with access to every restaurant, every theatre, every private club in Manhattan, and he chose to sit in a sealed room and keep the world away. Whether this was depression, illness, the accumulated damage of a lifetime of failed intimacy, or simply who Vincent had always been, depends on which biographer you ask. The answer is probably all of them at once. On February 3rd, 1959, Vincent Astor died of a heart attack in his Manhattan apartment. He was 67 years old, 3 marriages, no children, no heir to the fortune that had been passed from father to son for 5 generations. The gold watch from his father's pocket was somewhere in the apartment. It had traveled with him for 47 years, from a Harvard dormitory to a Manhattan lawyer's office, to the deck of a spy yacht in the Pacific, to this room, where everything finally stopped. Brooke was at his side. She was 56, and she had just inherited a problem that was also an opportunity. What to do with all of it? When Vincent Astor's will was filed for probate in New York, the document revealed a gross estate valued at $127 million. In today's terms, somewhere over $1 billion. 5 generations of Astor wealth, accumulated since a German immigrant started buying Manhattan farmland in the 1790s, concentrated into a single document signed by a man with no children. Brooke received $2 million outright, along with certain property. 25 additional bequests, totaling just over $800,000, went to employees, family members, and smaller charitable interests. Everything else, the overwhelming majority of the fortune, went to the Vincent Astor Foundation. His half-brother received nothing. John Jacob Astor VI had been born 4 months after their father drowned. Vincent had despised him from the beginning. The reasons were tangled and, in the way of family grudges, probably not fully rational. Vincent resented Madeline, the teenage stepmother he had loathed since his father's second wedding. That resentment extended to her child. He also resented the fact that Jakey existed at all, a living reminder that his father had started a second family with a girl barely older than Vincent himself. Over the decades, Vincent had gone further than simple dislike. He encouraged public rumors that Jakey was not actually their father's biological son. He made sure Jakey's reputation as a playboy and a spender stayed intact in the press. He froze him out of the family's social and business networks with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. Jakey had not been destitute. Their father's will, written before the Titanic voyage, had set aside $3 million in trust for any child born after the will's execution. Jakey inherited that sum on his 21st birthday, by which point it had grown to roughly $5 million. His mother, Madeline, also left him jewelry and a modest inheritance when she died in 1940. But these were fractions of what Vincent controlled. Jakey knew it. Everyone knew it. When the will was read, Jakey's response was blunt. Vincent had the legal, not the moral, right to keep all the money. He sued. The lawsuit targeted Brooke directly. Jakey argued that Vincent had been mentally incompetent when he signed his final will in June of 1958. The evidence he cited was Vincent's drinking, which by that point had been severe for years. Brooke, Jakey alleged, had brought liquor to Vincent in the hospital and used it to influence his decisions in her favor. Brooke countered that her husband had been fully competent. The case never went to trial. Jakey settled for $250,000, $250,000 from an estate worth more than $100 million. The legal system confirmed what Vincent had decided decades earlier. Jakey was not a real Astor, not in any way that counted. The physical empire dissolved quickly. Ferncliff, the 2,800-acre estate in Rhinebeck, where Astors had lived since the 19th century, was broken apart. Vincent had bequeathed the main house to a hospital in Kingston. Brooke later donated the Stanford White Pavilion to the Catholic Archdiocese. The woodlands became a forest preserve after a local businessman convinced Brooke to protect them from developers. The Noormahal, Vincent's floating headquarters for science and espionage, had already been given to the Navy during the war. The Manhattan properties were gradually sold or transferred. Within a few years of Vincent's death, there was almost nothing left that you could point to and say an Astor built that, and an Astor still owns it. The family that had defined New York real estate for a century had been reduced to a foundation, a cemetery plot, and a name. Vincent was buried at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Westchester. The plot is in Section 88. If you visit, you will find Brooke buried beside him. She outlived him by nearly half a century. The epitaph on her stone reads, "I had a wonderful life." Whether Vincent could have said the same is the question this documentary has been circling for the past hour. Brooke Astor had just turned 56 when she inherited the problem of the Astor fortune. She had been married to Vincent for 6 years. She had watched him refuse to leave the house. She had been forbidden from seeing her own son. And now she was standing in a Manhattan apartment with a dead husband, a charitable foundation worth tens of millions, and a city that had not heard the name Astor used kindly in a very long time. She decided to fix that. The Vincent Astor Foundation, under Brooke's direction, became a defining private philanthropy in New York City. She gave to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She gave to the New York Public Library, funding branch renovations across all 5 boroughs. She funded parks and community gardens. She underwrote after-school programs and renovations at public schools across the city. She showed up to inspect the projects herself, walking through Harlem and the South Bronx in her 80s, talking to librarians and groundskeepers and children. Her motto was a line she repeated so often it became inseparable from her name. Money is like manure. It is not worth a thing unless it is spread around. Brooke dispersed the entirety of the foundation's assets over the following decades. She liquidated it completely before she died, distributing everything rather than letting it accumulate behind an endowment. Vincent had spent years sitting on his wealth, parceling it out carefully, controlling who benefited and how. Brooke opened the valves. She gave money away the way Vincent had been afraid to, visibly, publicly, with her name on it and her face beside it. New York loved her for it. She became the kind of civic figure the city had not produced in decades. She sat on boards. She hosted fundraisers that actually raised funds. Henry Kissinger attended her dinner parties. Oscar de la Renta was a close friend. She was photographed constantly, always dressed sharply, always moving. She lived as though she had been saving up energy during those 6 sealed years with Vincent and was now spending it as fast as possible. She turned 90, then 95, then 100. And then the story turned. Brooke was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The decline was gradual at first, then severe. Her son from her first marriage, Anthony Marshall, had been named as her guardian and the manager of her financial affairs. He had never been close to her. Anthony had spent his life in her shadow, a veteran of the Second World War and occasional diplomat who never managed to establish an identity separate from the Astor name. What he did with his mother's money was not subtle. He awarded himself a raise of $1 million a year for managing her estate. A Childe Hassam painting called Flags, Fifth Avenue, which she had specifically earmarked for the Metropolitan Museum, turned up at auction. Staff members who had served her for decades found themselves dismissed without explanation. Holly Hill, her country estate where she had told friends she wanted to die, went dark. Her doctor visits grew less frequent. Her prescriptions were quietly reduced. Brooke Astor, the woman who had become New York's most generous private benefactor, was found living in conditions her own grandson later described as squalor. Her couch was stained. Her nightgown was torn. The dog was relieving itself on the floor. In 2006, her grandson, Philip Marshall, filed a petition to have his father removed as guardian. The petition alleged elder abuse. It made the front page of the New York Daily News. Annette de la Renta, wife of Oscar, was appointed as Brooke's new guardian. The Manhattan District Attorney opened an investigation. The trial began in 2009. It lasted 5 months. Nearly 70 witnesses testified, including Henry Kissinger, Barbara Walters, and Graydon Carter. The prosecution called it the story of how a son would stoop so low as to steal from his own mother in the final years of her life. Anthony Marshall was convicted on 14 of 16 counts: grand larceny, scheming to defraud, possession of stolen property. His lawyer, Francis Morrissey, was convicted on all counts against him, including forgery. Both were sentenced to 1 to 3 years in prison. Brooke never saw the verdict. She had died on August 13, 2007, at the age of 105, pneumonia, at her home in Briarcliff Manor. I keep thinking about the shape of this story. A fortune built by a fur trader in the 1790s, expanded by landlords who never sold, inherited by a boy whose father drowned, carried through failed marriages and secret intelligence work, passed to a woman who managed to give it away with grace, and then stolen, piece by piece, by her own child. The Astor fortune did not end with a crash or a market collapse. It ended with a torn nightgown and a dog on the floor.